I just want to also make an announcement. So July 30th was the day I kind of picked when I just made the decision that we need a few volunteers for Wednesday evening during the summer when the kids have kind of a Bible Life sort of class to keep them going for Bible Life. So that's a Wednesday evening, I think around 6:30 to 8 o'clock, something like that. We need like 3 or 4 people. So we'll talk about it some more later, but it's at the end of July. Also, Eric Patterson will cover for me. I'm planning on that 2 weeks from now. Dale and I will be out away in Colorado on a trip with the family. All right. I was thinking about a little bit more about last week. We looked at Mary and Jesus again and that relationship at the Cana and all. And I was pondering about it and just, I can't say dogmatically, of course, because it doesn't have it in the text or anything, but I was just thinking, I would feel like the sense that Jesus at least would sort of, he wouldn't just do things cold turkey to his mom. You might, in other words, hey, I'm not, we're related, but, it's different now. I think he probably would have prepped her a little bit with, letting her know, I'm going to be going on my public ministry here and things are going to change, you might say. I just, speculating, but I don't know. But so I don't think it was totally something out of the blue, maybe that Jesus just sort of struck her with Madam, that kind of addressing. So anyway, that was my perspective on that. I have no clue whether it's right or not, but I just sensed it, my idea there. All right, we're on the 12th lesson in the book of John. Last week we finished the wedding at Cana, and we looked at the response, and of course with the wine shortage issue. Jesus follows the lead of the Father. He's not going to be bullied by anybody or coerced into doing something that he had not planned to do. So in one sense we see that he does put kind of a little bit of a space between him and his mom, just to let her know, because she's a sinner also. She's going to be need of salvation. Nobody has an inside track, as we said, on the Trinity. Everybody comes in on the same level, you might say. We looked about the idea of we looked at the water jars and all, the number of them, which represented the quantity involved in there. And then of course it was the use of them. They were for religious purification. Remember that kind of Old Testament purification. And then also we talked about the uniqueness of this miracle in the sense that Jesus, he didn't speak to it, right? He didn't say water become wine, so to speak. It just happened, you might say, just in silence in a way. And so it was just, we looked at the miracle in essence, and when you try to think about what actually happened, the conversion of water to wine is beyond our comprehension, ability to obviously be able to do in any sense of the word there. So we looked at that, and then also that the feast master, the guy who ran the master, the host and all, he basically gave, because nobody tasted it before this guy did, and he gave a very objective opinion. He had no clue where this wine came from. He just tasted it, and wow, this stuff is better than anything I've tasted. You held the good wine till late, which is the opposite of what everybody else does. So it also seemed to be kind of a semi-public miracle. It wasn't something like this broadcast, even though I'm sure the word got out pretty hastily about what had happened, but it wasn't just out in the open the way we're going to see many others take place. All right. Where there was also probably about only his current disciples. There were probably five or six, the ones that are listed basically in chapter 1. And then we also looked at the idea of this transformation to water to wine to be something that is representative of what happened sort of like Old Testament to New Testament, the idea there. And also we looked at several, there was a lot of themes that run through the Old Testament talking about wine and in terms of like, how it can be debilitating, how it can be a terrible thing to fall, substance abuse and so forth, especially in the book of Proverbs, but also it is representative of good things like joy and all. And I wanted to just start with, as notable that in Romans 14:17, I'll read this one, it's not up there, that Paul writes, "For the kingdom of God is not a matter of eating and drinking, but of righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit." I think there's just sort of a subtle connection in there between that wine and joy and the Holy Spirit's kingdom. All right, so we're going to move on, and we're going to look at the next passage in here. And we're going to start with John 2:12. We're just reading some paragraphs here just to get them informed. We're probably just going to focus on the second paragraph, 13 to 17 today, but I just want to get the context in here. Go ahead.
After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. Then they stayed there for a few days.
Okay.
The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen, sheep, and pigeons, and a money changer sitting there. And making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me."
All right, and then Seth, if you could read the next part.
So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken.
We're recording, right? Okay. All right, so we look back first where we started with the first 12 there at John read. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and he stayed there a few days. This is after the wedding in Cana. I'm curious, what do you think the conversations were like?
In the Capernaum?
Well, from what happened in Cana to all of a sudden he's trekking down to Capernaum. I mean, you do that. You know, you'd be kind of out of your mind, blown out of your mind here trying to process this kind of event here, right? It'd be pretty massive thing there. I mean, who are you're walking with right here who has changed water to wine? I think it would be just something that would be like, you could never, you'd just be pondering that in your head probably, you know, in that whole.
I mean, back in that time, I'm sure you had magicians and people who did kind of things that looked like miracles.
Right.
And maybe you're thinking,
Well, you know. Yeah, right. Something going on there, yeah. I mean, they certainly understood the stories from the Old Testament, Exodus, with pharaohs, magicians, and so forth like that. Maybe there was that, but I was it like awkward kind of a thing, you know? What do you do with this?
I wonder about his brothers too, you know. Here Jesus is, you know, and was this something so unusual for them to think of him this way? Or because, you know, we don't know that he did anything miraculous as a child or anything. There's nothing recorded. And, you know, the disciples, it says the disciples believed, but it didn't say his brothers believed.
Right.
You know, and later on they didn't, you know, they weren't always with him.
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
That's a good point. Yeah, but the idea was there that there was a lot of issues with, you know, how they would have accepted him for who he was, and but the point is he's going to go ahead and trek down to Capernaum, and the elevation is higher in Cana than it is, so he is going actually from west going down a bit eastward, but it is lower in elevation, down to the Sea of Galilee. So the direction is correct in the Bible as far as it says he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and disciples, and he stayed there for a few days. So he's going to set up base of operations in Capernaum. So he's basically moving from Nazareth over to Capernaum. Probably his whole family moved there, I suspect. But why would he do that? What's in Capernaum? What's a larger city? Got more access, you know, for more ability to spread the word, what he wants to do and all. So he goes there. In fact, Mark 2:1-2, if you could read that. See that?
And when he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home, and many were gathered together, so that there was no more room, not even at the door. And he was preaching the word to them. And
That's that. What version are you reading there? Not the ESV, I don't think.
it is the ESV.
It isn't? Really? Okay. All right.
And that's
Yeah,
1 and
maybe.
2, right?
Okay, yeah. But so what did they say? They said, and when the people heard that he was home, okay, so this is now home base to him, all right? So from this point on, he'll become, but from this point, like you said, Dale, there's going to be an estrangement between him and his family. And again, you know, the miracle in Cana, how these things happen, We don't know, but if you're going to find out, it's just sort of a strange thing. They're going to believe that he's out of his mind, okay? So let's look at Mark 30, 20 to 21. 3, I'm sorry, Mark 3.
What?
Mark 3.
3, 20 to 21. Then he went home, and the crowd gathered again, so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, he is out of his mind.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then 30, I don't have it up there. Let me read this. I'm sorry, I missed this. And his mother and his brothers came from Mark 3:31. And standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. And he answered them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. Sounds like he's getting some distance in here, you know. Let's understand the nature of the relationships that I'm associated with. But obviously, so there's a breakdown, you might say, or some kind of difference here.
But wasn't there, I mean, the beginning of this breakdown, didn't that, when he was younger and they took him to the temple and Mary didn't have him and Joseph didn't have him, and they found him in the temple preaching?
I mean, I think they understood something that different about him, clearly at that point. I don't know if that would be a point at which they...
Because he says, I'm going about my Father's will.
And we're going to get to that verse later. Thank you. But
Did it
I wish I had to.
so I'm not going to give you demerit for getting ahead of us. So anyway, but yes. But I don't know that that would have caused, you know, an estrangement, other than because it says she treasured all these things up in her heart. You know, in a sense, it was just sort of like, what does this all mean, kind of a thing. So let's move on. But anyway, I think this is your favorite verse there, isn't it? Brandon?
That's the one.
So this is what, before you read it, what I'm trying to get at is that in chapters John 2, 3, and 4, there's kind of a theme that's going to come about. We've just looked at the idea of, that we looked at, did I put it in here? Okay, replacement of old purifications, for instance, with the wine of the kingdom of God, which is in Cana, right? So old stuff with new stuff. Then the old temple by the new in the risen Lord. Here's what we're going to be looking at kind of today and next week. And then the exposition of the new birth and the new creation, which is John chapter 3, you must be born again. And then you have the contrast of Jacob's well water with the Christ living water, the old versus the new, in John chapter 4, the woman at the well, and then the worship at Jerusalem, the same conversation from Jerusalem to Gerizim with worship in spirit and truth. So there's sort of a theme that is involved in here. I'll just mention that, but the idea of going old to new, I know that's one of your favorite verses there. Would you please read that?
Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. All things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. That's King James. I'm memorizing King James. Seems more poetic.
Yes.
But what I was thinking about at the end of last week's lesson, and you touched on it again in the review this morning, the part about the wine.
Yeah.
You know, in there it talks about the 6 jars, which holds 20 to 30 gallons of water. And they said those are not regular jars, those are stone jars.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, wow, he's taking nothing and he's going to make something out of it. And it's stone, just like your heart, my heart, all mankind's heart is made of stone until God comes along and touches that heart of stone, fills it with his living water, and transforms it into wine. Not only wine, but the best wine. Just as that is an illustration of what he does when he reaches down to our stone hearts and he makes us that new creation, just as 2 Corinthians 5:17 says, and all the family concerns about brothers and sisters and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Some of your family, some of my family, they don't really believe in a new life in Christ.
Right.
They've gone along with religious upbringing, as we all did, most of us, as we were growing up. But until we make that initial decision and are awakened by the very Word of God, which is what John opens up with. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yeah.
Jesus was the Word, and this is the very Word of God, which we gather His knowledge and brings us to a decision to follow what He is opening up to everyone who wants to find out about what's going on in this world, what is our purpose in life. And Jesus just does, it's just so perfect. It's so simple that all we have to do is open our hearts to Him, and He will come to us. But He's waiting on us. It's a decision on our part, but yet He's always there calling to us. So that's a long speech.
Well, that's a nice illustration. I like the illustration. That's pretty cool. I hadn't thought about that.
And it's interesting, as we become a new creature in Christ, oftentimes we do have estrangements within our families
Right.
because, there's a division there.
And
Right,
I
that's
know
true.
about that, and I know about those things too.
Right.
So
There often is conflict that results from it. That's right. Yeah. Okay, so I just wanted to bring that up, that there's a theme in there, and as we see, even this old versus new, old creation, new creation. Thank you, Brent. Each of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have an account of a temple cleansing, so we'll talk about the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. What's the difference in theirs? Would anybody know what?
Of the illustration of that event?
Well, yes, when they write it, what's the account of it in each of them? How is it distinctly different than John's?
Well, Luke is from the doctor's perspective.
Okay. I'm not thinking along those lines.
Oh, okay.
But I'm thinking along, just where is it placed in the gospel? Just think about where they put it.
It's later, right?
Yeah.
Later. It's at the end of Jesus' ministry when he does the temple cleansing. In this account, he is doing it at the start of his ministry. So there's always been a debate about whether there was only one or were actually, in fact, two temple cleansings. One that he did at the beginning of his ministry, one that he did at his end. I think when we look at it chronologically, because you don't necessarily have to write the gospel with strict chronological accuracy, and John, you can say, might actually employ that. But I think in this particular instance, we can feel pretty certain that it actually were two cleansings along here. There really was one in the beginning, one at the end. There's some differences between the two of them. We'll just mention them as we go through it. But it's clear, I think we can say that, we can feel comfortable saying that there were two cleansings. It's not like any issue to say that there were. But if you want to say there was one, that's fine. I'm not going to have a big argument with it. But I think it's safe to say that there were two. So we start with verse 13. It says, "The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem." So Jesus is now going to start traveling into
Where
ministry.
are you now?
And verse 13. So the start of.
No, we're back at John.
Yeah. So.
I'm sorry.
I was wondering the same thing.
I'm sorry, I jumped around a little.
John.
John 2:13. Yeah,
Okay.
so the Passover of the Jews was at hand. Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So he mentions, first of all, this was the Passover. And it's a very, it's a significant event in the Jewish life, all right? And it's for cultural, historical, religious reasons. And the Passover is probably the most significant feast in the Jewish life, and the males needed to attend. Now he says, we'll go over these feasts in just a moment here quickly, but he says that Passover of the Jews was at hand, which means it was just about to happen. The idea that it was within time range of a day or two, a few days kind of a thing. So it wasn't any time far off. It says Jesus, what was the direction he went to? He went up, which is again sensical because the Sea of Galilee is lower in elevation than Jerusalem, which is higher. So he goes up to Jerusalem. So you got to think of this as also being a trek, an arduous journey in some way, because again, he's not driving a four-wheeler or anything like that. They got to walk. They have to hoof this. So they traveled to Jerusalem, probably maybe a 2-day journey, and it does, make you wonder, man, how did they get reservations at the inn? I mean, it is so easy for us. You pull up the app now on your phone and you're, locating the hotel. But I can't imagine what it was like during that time to make accommodations and so forth.
Because Jerusalem would have been very crowded.
Yes,
And
indeed. So even, the journey enough is hard, but then it's packed with people. And so just finding a location, it's just a miracle almost like, but.
Yeah, kids sure can't where they could find the space.
Well, but then are you carrying all this camping gear with you too? I
They
mean,
didn't need camping gear. They're not, all they needed was a blanket.
well, I mean, maybe so, but I mean, are they gonna sleep out in the open? Still, you need accommodations for toiletries and, you know, where they have outhouses and stuff. You know,
Probably just the
latrines and
woods.
stuff. Anyway, all right. I don't want to go down too deep down that hole there, but anyway, but I just love to know, where's the source of the money coming from? So like, you know, the FBI, where'd you get forensic evidence, you know, what's the source of the money? I'd be curious, did he save up a lot of this? You know, we know there were some people who would contribute to the ministry, but how early did they get started with it? I just wonder about some of those things. Makes it.
I always thought like maybe people did a lot less with money and more about just trading services for services. You know,
That's-
like if you let me stay here tonight,
Yeah.
you know, I can do X, Y, Z.
Build you a table or something.
Wash your dishes.
You know, yeah, like that there was a lot more bartering going on
Hey.
for a lot of these daily things. You know.
Yeah, but he's got a horde of maybe 12 disciples is what we're thinking now. That's a lot of people, you know. But that's a good point. I don't know. I'm just a wonder. You know, it makes me
And
wonder.
what makes you not think that they didn't have family there, that they
Yes.
could stay with their family?
Some of them.
I don't know.
I
It's just no detail about it, you know. But it's possible.
But it
that he-
wasn't necessary for them. I mean, God didn't think that it was that necessary.
They talked about, like, he was in Peter's house, and remember, because Peter's mother-in-law got sick and stuff, so, you know, I think, like in the Sea of Galilee, they all had houses and family kind of close by, but when they traveled other places, you know, probably not.
But I mean, it would be packed in Jerusalem.
Yeah,
I
right,
mean,
at this time.
the numbers would swell, probably, you know, maybe 3 or 4 times what the normal population was. So, at any rate, we talk about, so this is the first event that's going to be the first great confrontation Jesus will have with the Jews, okay? And what was the significance of Passover? Just tell me what happened at Passover. What was the main,
That's what
The
it
origin of it was whenever they were in Egypt.
They
okay?
have to kill the lamb.
Have to
Yeah.
kill the lamb? Okay,
Yeah.
what happened at Passover? What was
Well, the angel of death came over.
Right, it was to rescue the people,
Right,
the Israelites, right, out of Egypt, bring
Anything
them.
that had the blood over the.
Right, and basically bring them to the promised land, right? So you can find details on it in Exodus 12, 13, and Leviticus 23. But at any rate, the Passover meal was observed, it was coupled with the feast. These are the list of the Jewish feasts, by the way. Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of First Fruits, Feast of Weeks, which is Pentecost, Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles. Many of these were tied to the agricultural things that happened, events during the year, you know, the harvest, the seeding and harvest and so forth like that. But the first one that they generally went to is Passover, and I have some of them in red because these are ones that were dedicated to be, if you were male, you were supposed to go there every time that happened. Okay, it was supposed to go to Jerusalem. And so we look at this, and all of the feasts, they have a redemptive story, illustration that they're trying to show. And we're not going to go over those right now. But obviously we think of Passover. Jesus is our Passover, right? So he rescued us from sin. But the 3 that are required for the pilgrimage feast were feast. Well, I might say 1. This is 1, 2, and 3. Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Weeks, and Feast of Tabernacles. You're supposed to go there every time that happens. And Deuteronomy 16 to 17, you can look at that. Who's up next? Yeah, Jason.
3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, at the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of booths. They shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God, that he has given you.
Thanks. 3 times a year. You heard the list there, okay? Yeah, Elizabeth, if you could read 16, 5 to 6.
You may not offer the Passover sacrifice within any of your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, but at the place that the Lord your God will choose, to make his name dwell in it. There you shall offer the Passover sacrifice in the evening at sunset at the time you came out of Egypt.
Okay, so you couldn't just do it in any particular place. You had to do it in the place that was specified, the Passover.
So it always had to be in Jerusalem?
No, I mean, originally this was during the days of the tabernacle and wilderness and that kind of
Oh,
stuff.
okay,
so-
wherever the tabernacle
Yeah,
was.
yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so, and then, but were Mary and Joseph, were they did they keep this routine? Wendy, if you could read Luke 2:41 to 42.
Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year.
Stop. What did you say?
Now his parents.
Every year. Okay, thank you. Read on.
At the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom.
Right, thank you. Okay, you see that? So they held to going to the Passover feast every year. They were dedicated to it. In the temple, okay, in verse 14, in the temple, this is back in John, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and the money changers sitting there. Now, we have to understand the temple at this time was not the one that Solomon built. Remember David had collected all of the furnishings that would be used to construct the temple, all the wood and stones and things like that, and then Solomon ended up building it because God said, you're not going to build it, you're a man of blood, basically. You have too many battles. I want a man of peace to build it. Okay? So when he did this, he basically, what happened after Solomon's reign? Just give me a quick, very, very quick synopsis.
There was a division of the
Division.
tribes,
And
and so
But you have Assyria, take away Israel,
Right.
and
right, so Israel went into idolatry, right? Gross idolatry. God called in the Assyrian upper kingdom and so forth, the northern kingdom. The Assyrians took them, and then, but the temple, the big temple that Solomon built was in Jerusalem. What happened to that one?
Babylonians took it.
Babylonians came and overtook, and they just broke it down and trashed the whole place, right? So the temple was destroyed, and for the next 70 years or so after that, it languished, and then finally the Jews started coming back from Babylon, and they rebuilt the temple, and Haggai is a book that deals with the restoration of the temple. But when they constructed it, was it anything like Solomon's temple? No, it was diminutive. It was just nothing compared to what Solomon's temple was.
old people cried.
Yes, exactly right. Right. There were some that wept and some that rejoiced.
But
Yep.
the people who saw the original would have gone into exile and came back, which would have been really young in order to be.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they saw it, and everybody was rejoicing, and the really old people cried because they're like, "This is not like it was."
Right. So this is now the second temple, is what it's called. Okay. First is Solomon's. This is now the second, and it's just something called the second temple. And what happens is that, of course, Israel during the intertestamental period, Israel kind of gets ruled by different dynasties. We won't go into the history of it, but basically, eventually, what comes out of it is around 18 BC, a guy by the name of Herod the Great comes along, and this guy is kind of a little bit of Jewish. He's kind of a bit of a mongrel. He's Idumean, is what it is, and he is kind of a Roman client governor, you might say, and he basically is given power over the area of Judea, and he is manic about building programs. He did like Masada and a number of other kind of big scope things. Well, he decided also to curry favor with the Jews of the time because they hated him and he hated them. He said, well, let's make peace, okay? I'll build you a temple. And so he now begins construction on a temple that is going to take like 80 years to build, to do this renovation. 80 years. But he starts it in 18 BC, so it's still being renovated when Jesus is there, okay? And then it is going to continue to be renovated for another 40 years or so after that, and it will be basically, when it's finally finished, it will be utterly destroyed in 6 years after that. In 80-70. It's just kind of an amazing historical note there, but that is what happens to them.
Well,
So-
it says here it took 46 years to build the temple, so it must have been before.
Because it
18
has been renovated for 46 years, is what's going to happen.
Before that.
Yeah, it's been going on for 46 years.
Yeah.
Now, the idea was that they weren't saying, in essence, look, it's been, it took 46 years to build it, and it's been some time since that has passed. It's still under renovation is what's going on.
It's in the same spot. It's just like they're renovating. When you say renovate as opposed to like creating from nothing.
Yeah, I'm saying that they took
it's all in the same area.
They're taking the temple that there was, and I don't know if they may have torn, like you see these rehab houses that they completely redo and so forth on the shows, but it doesn't tell us exactly what happened, if it was just, they kept the central part of the temple and then just everything around it, they just added a whole bunch of stuff to it. Because it became quite a structure, very imposing, it was very impressive. It became really, this was the centerpiece of Judaism, of the Jewish religion. It was that big of a structure and all. And it was just, you'd be awed by it, it was so large. So, at any rate, when it says in the idea there, they have to have a sacrifice, right, for Passover. Now, if you are traveling from a place like 80 miles away or something, and you got to worry about, first of all, your own accommodation, but you got to worry about dragging an animal with you, that's all the more difficult, right? So it was possible to go ahead and just travel there, and then you could simply just buy an animal if you needed one. If you weren't close to the environs of Jerusalem, that you could have the service provided, that you could just buy an animal and then do that as your Passover sacrifice. But there were also rather strict requirements. If you did bother to bring your own animal, what was the quality of that animal? Who's next to read? Would you like to read? Okay. I believe we're on somewhere around Exodus 2. Exodus 12, 1 through 5, sorry. Yeah.
The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goat."
Thank you. What was your name one more time?
Anna.
Anna, thank you, Anna. And what was the key ingredient? What was the quality that the lamb had?
Without blemish.
Without blemish, right? So it couldn't have sores, and couldn't have broken, legs or whatever, things like that. It had to be basically it had to be all wholesome and without issues with it to be presented, because God wanted the best, right? And representative of Christ ultimately is what it's going to be. And but the other thing was it had to be what? Male or female?
Male.
Male, right? And you could do it also from the sheep or from the goats, but I presume mostly it was from the sheep. That's predominantly what we hear. So they had, in order, because travelers who could not bring a goat with them, or you weren't a sheep herder or a goat herder, you would, Jesus was a carpenter in his family, so why would he be involved with doing goat herding and all? So it made sense to set up a service for those who needed an animal to purchase. But what happens is now here's where corruption and issues can arise, right? If you have to purchase an animal, and what sometimes has to happen, well, you may have money based in one denomination because that's where you live and that's the coinage they use, and now you're down in Jerusalem. Now you have to get your money changed, right? And have you ever gone to those international places, the cambios or whatever, and you had to change money? What do they always take?
A tenth?
Well, I don't know, I think it's more like 3 or
Have a fee,
4%.
change fee.
Yeah, it's a change fee, probably around 3% or something like that. But
As well as there's a change rate. How much do you get?
Right, based
yeah,
on
and an exchange rate as well, right? So you're always facing those issues there, and if maybe these are the only people you can deal with, well, monopolies get set up, and so it's all that more difficult. If you don't have competition in it, then obviously it can lead to a lot of corruption in there. And also there was a temple tax that had to be paid, and that again was another thing that you had to have converted to the right coinage there. So everything is involved about money, okay? And then also now, in the presence of these animals. So they are now at the temple, and we are in, as I said, this is Herod's temple, and the place where these guys are going to be gathered around, where all this transaction is going to take place, is called the Court of the Gentiles, which is kind of the biggest area outside the main structure, the heart of the temple itself, the sanctuary area. And of course, that was, the Holy of Holies and those that spot there. So this is out past beyond the court of men, the court of women, and now you're in the general area here, the court of the Gentiles. All right. And so you have these two basic people groups that are doing the transactions. You have the animal sellers, and then you've got the money changers, right? Now, if you've got a bunch of animals around you, what are you going to have?
Smell.
A mess, right? The smells. You got cleanup on aisle 3, right? I mean, all kinds of issues with the mess, the stench, and so forth.
And the noise.
The noise, exactly right. So it says then that in verse 15, and making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade. So just imagine being there at that scene. Has anybody watched The Chosen? Did they do this scene?
I didn't see that season yet, but that's
Okay.
season 4 is going to have that.
Okay. That's what I wanted to know. I want to know in reality what happened. But if you want to know, you watch The Chosen, right? We tried looking at it yesterday on some program. It was kind of interesting, but
Is it out?
it wasn't The Chosen. It was a different thing. It was something else. Okay. So it was just it was sort of a premeditative act, right? I mean, he says he making a whip of cords, right? So he has to take a little bit of time to weave this thing together. So
I could just see him walking around, and he's just sitting
Okay.
there, and he's weaving this thing and
Yeah.
looking around, and the more
Just
he
getting
weaves,
angrier
the
and angrier?
frustrated, and how dare you do this to my father?
Good point.
Because I'm about to do my father's
Yeah.
business, and this is what you're doing.
Right, and imagine if you were one of his disciples, you're walking around with him, and you're watching him do this, What's going to happen here, right?
Next, I'm not seeing him this fresh.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Was it the
Irritated.
greed of the people that were changing money, or just that they were doing it?
Good point. Let me just distinguish that right now. The difference partly between what we find in John's issue here, John's narrative here, versus what happens in the Synoptics is John's is at the beginning, and it is basically the location that is upsetting Jesus. When he gets to the Synoptics, it is the corruption. So there is a difference there, because he said, you have made my Father's house a den of thieves, and so forth like that. That's later. This is really the location. He's upset about that. Good point there. All right, so, but we look at this, it says Jesus drove them all out. Now, I don't know how many were there. I'm just going to take a guess. You've got, thousands of people coming in, flocking into the city just to buy, deal with this feast here. Maybe there's 20, maybe there's 40 or 50 people that he's driving out, I don't know, but it had to be more than just a couple is what I'm thinking. I mean, this was a ruckus that sort of happened, and it's just not a single money changer was left. So he poured, what's he say? He says he pours out the coins and flips the tables of the money changers. Where's all that money going to be rolling into? Probably the animal waste and all, right? So I'm just guessing it would have been quite a mess, and probably would have stirred up a lot of anger and hostility from those who all of a sudden took a loss here. But if you were seeing this, what would you be thinking?
Who is this guy?
Well, this guy's crazy, right? He's out of his mind again. But you'd be, let me get my camera. I'm gonna put this on my channel, okay? This will be something for the books. So now, did Jesus whip the money changers? I don't know. These are the animals, but he's not against the sacrificial use of animals. I want to make sure it's not that. It is really, again, against the location of these guys. And commentator D.A. Carson says about these, he says, at one time, the animal merchants set up their stalls across the Kidron Valley on the slope of the Mount of Olives. But at this point, they were in the temple courts, doubtless in the court of the Gentiles, the outermost court. Why was Jesus so upset about this? It was a beneficial service to people, right? Okay. But it says instead of the solemn dignity that the temple deserved, now you'd hear the sounds of mooing and bleating of sheep, right? Instead of really, it was supposed to be a site of brokenness, of contrition, of returning to God, petitioning Him, praying, and instead you just hear the bickering and arguing over prices of animals and so forth like that. So it was all a distraction from focusing on what the true meaning of the temple was, right? Leon Morris, he wrote, "The court in which all this noisy and boisterous traffic occurred was the only court to which the Gentiles might go when they wished to pray or meditate in the temple, because it was off limits everywhere else. This was the only place. They ought to have been able to worship in peace. Instead, they found themselves in the middle of a noisy bazaar, a place that should have stood as a symbol for the freedom of access of all nations and prayer to God had become a place associated with sordid, pecuniary, or monetary interests." All right? So Jesus's physical action was not cruel to the animals. I mean, you can't get animals to move unless you got a whip, right, to move them along. And it certainly wasn't disruptive enough to call down Roman soldiers into the scene to kind of get control. But so his action seems really kind of proportional, because remember, he drives the animals out, but then does he do the same with the doves? It's sort of a special, gentle handling of the doves, right? That he does. It basically says, take these away from here, and instead he doesn't, throw them around in the cages and all. So it's somewhat proportional. But it brings up the question: is it right to use violence at times as a Christian?
Yeah.
Yeah, war.
Wars.
Wars, okay, just war. Okay.
Well, what's the violence here? The flipping of the tables?
Right. I mean,
And
just the whole scene of driving out,
cord.
just breaking up this
I mean, I don't know if the
disturbance of the
whipping of the
peace.
animals is necessarily violent, if that's the only way to get them to move. Like, I mean, I know that sounds harsh, but, like, you're not going to get the animal to move without whipping it, potentially.
Yeah.
Might have whipped the
You know.
men too.
Obviously, that would be violence
Yeah.
to whip a person.
Well, it says
or-
here he drove them out of the temple with the sheep and oxen. So it seems to me that he was doing the whipping toward the
I mean, he
people
could have-
more than it is toward the
Right.
animals.
And maybe if you got in the way of the whip, that was your problem or something. I don't know.
Yeah,
What?
God destroying whole cities, men, women, children,
Okay.
babies, tell them to do that, which a lot of people have trouble, dealing
Yeah. Yeah.
with that.
Right. Well, that's God. Okay. But I'm just thinking for us as Christians.
Well, but
I mean,
violence is,
right. I mean, we think of self-protection obviously as a way that we can justify being violent, of course, if we have to protect loved ones and so forth. But in that sense, we just think of Jesus as being the man of peace, and all of a sudden he's taking some really hardcore action here. And we just, man, that is just so unlike you to do that, But Jesus is pure passion, I mean, in essence, of righteous passion. And we need to look at it like that. Was it a reckless act? In essence, I think, in terms of, let's say there was kids in the area or something like that, and it starts a stampede or something, I'm just throwing it out there. I just would love to see what actually, what happened transpired there. It'd be something to know about and see. Be curious,
Well, he was about his father's business.
Yes.
yeah.
So I'm sure his father had a little bit
Okay.
of control in this situation
Okay.
too.
Would keep things so they didn't get too out of control there.
I
think
mean,
you're right.
I don't know, like you said, but I just know that God is able to do whatever he wants
Yes.
to do.
Right. So he can sovereignly control where these animals are going to run and so forth. Yeah, I agree with you. I just throwing it out there just as something to just sort of think about. It's okay. Now, it talks about, he uses the language, it says, the house, or my father's house. Why is the temple called, the house of God in this sense?
Because where God was dwelling.
Okay,
That's-
right. I mean, there's obviously,
Kind of
and that means there's sort of a connection. We stay in a house, right? So, and that's sort of like we are in a house and God is in a house. And I think that it's sort of a way that we can easily connect. It's an informal way. You say temple, it stands on its own. You might say it's vastly different. We wouldn't call our house a temple, basically, but we would call, what the temple is its own place where you go to worship God. But if you call it God's house, it's I just think of it as sort of an informalizing of the name, you might say, to help us connect a little bit more with the Lord himself. I want to look over a couple of the uses of the term. It's somewhat familiar in the Old Testament, the use of it. Psalm 27:4, is that you, Veronica?
One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple.
So did you hear the two words there? House of the Lord, at the end of it, the temple. They're basically the same, obviously the same thing. It's just a nice, easy way of saying the house of the Lord, you might say. In fact, we have songs that we talk about house of the Lord and so forth. And so we talked about it. And Andy, were you going to read also, or did you pass? Okay. John, would you read Psalm 84:10?
Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked.
Right. House of the Lord. Yeah. Same thing as being the temple. And then even at the time of Solomon's temple being built, let me read this in more speed. 2 Corinthians 7:11-12. Thus Solomon finished the house of the Lord and the king's house, all that Solomon had planned to do in the house of the Lord, and in his house he successfully accomplished. Then the Lord appeared to Solomon in the night and said to him, I have heard your prayer and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. Interesting there. So we find this house of the Lord is used kind of frequently. What significance is there in Jesus calling God his Father? Do you think that was sort of bold, audacious sounding? It definitely would have been, okay? It would have been off-putting. They would have been shocked by the language, because you don't call God your Father in the sense that the way that Jesus is going to address him as, my Father's house and so forth. So this was pretty much fiery language, but it wasn't inflammatory enough to be blasphemous, which we will find in John chapter 5 is what happens when he equates what his work is with God the Father's work, okay? And he is also basically saying, I am above the law. So we'll look at that and eventually get there. But it is significant that he would use the title. Does he have, now, when we talk about it, why doesn't he say, our Father's house?
Because that would have been all inclusive of all of them. He wanted to be very specific with mine.
And there's also, he wants to demonstrate there is a difference in our relationship with the Father than our relationship as humans, do. So, in other words, when he says in John 20:17, did I have that up here?
Nope.
Sorry. He says, and when he was resurrected, do not cling to me, Jesus said, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go and tell my brothers, I am ascending to my Father and your Father. Okay, he doesn't say, I am ascending to our Father. He makes it clear, there's a distinction there. And that's the same way it is. When he talks about Matthew 6:9, he says, how do you pray? Our Father. Here's how you are to pray, our Father. It doesn't say how I am to pray, it's how you are to pray, our Father, right? So Jesus had that special connection to the temple at his Father's house 12 years ago. 12 years of age. Peggy, you brought this up earlier. Well, John, do you have, who's next? Bill, okay. Luke 2:43. Can I read it? Let me just go ahead and finish it just for speed here. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it, but supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey. But then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances, and when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem looking for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. All who heard were amazed at his understanding and his answers, and when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress. And he said to them, why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house? And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. So even at 12 years old, like you were mentioning, Peggy, it was his connection with my Father's house, the temple. That's where I belong. So we look at this and let's skip a little bit here. So his disciples, look at the last verse here. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. John uses it is written. You remember what Matthew often uses for the term in order to say something that was done already, that was prophesied? Matthew uses the idea of this was to fulfill. You will often see that in Matthew's gospel. John just simply says it was written, or it is written, okay? So when we look at this idea from, he's quoting Psalm 69. His disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house has consumed me. The idea there was, if I put up there, zeal for your house has consumed me, what is the tense in there?
Present?
Zeal for your house has consumed me.
Past.
That's past tense, right? In this quotation that John is going to do, he's going to quote it, but he's going to modify it. He says what? Zeal for your house will consume me. Okay? That's a change in tense. This is now future. And the idea there of the consuming there, the idea is that it really is to devour, to eat up. And we use this term ourselves a lot. You know, that person's, he's just being eaten up by this problem, right? We use it in our own vernacular. And so it's really common, it's interesting to use the same way here. And the Garden of Eden, Genesis 2:16, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, you may surely eat of every tree of the garden. It's the same word, basically. You may eat, you may devour, you may consume. And that's the idea of what it is here. It says, your zeal for your house has consumed me. There's definitely the idea that Jesus' passion is to ensure the proper worship of God, but the idea is there that this passion will eventually kill him. That's really what it's saying, okay? The zeal for your house, for me to maintain my passion for you, it is going to cost me my life. And that is what's essentially going to happen as we look at in Mark 14:52. Let me just read this passage. 14:55-60. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witnesses against him, but their testimony did not agree. Some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree. So they tried to capture him in this whole idea of the temple. The business of this temple was what they used against him. Now eventually they can't even get the witnesses to figure out what he actually said. And we'll look at the interpretation of how it is meant to be. But the idea was that the zeal for your house has consumed me. It's basically sort of a literal fulfillment of what's going to happen here. It really is going to kill him. Final comment by D.A. Carson, and we'll head out. Jesus' cleansing of the temple testifies to his concern for pure worship, a right relationship with God at the place supremely designated to serve as the focal point of the relation between God and man. But it is that very concern that is attracting opposition, the Jews, of course. For John, the manner in which Jesus will be consumed is doubtless going to be his death, which is, of course, his crucifixion. All right, any questions, comments, response? No, thanks. Anybody else says, cut now. Well, let me pray us out. Lord,